Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 567, October 18th, 1982. I apologize for the delay in tape. We had trouble with the recording machinery that was taped off the air Monday night, and I had to do the broadcast over, and then there was a hum using a different machine and different microphones, and had to do it one more time over. This happened 3 or 4 years ago where we had a mechanical breakdown on 2 different machines. I don't know what's happening, but that's what happened. But we'll get on with the news, and it's the same news that got Monday night, except that I have to redo the broadcast for you, and we'll use the same information, and I will not even update it with the latest news the past 2 days. We'll pick it up next week. It's broadcast number 567, October the 18th, 1982. I want to make a correction right away from last week's error. There was an error that I have not made, I don't think, very often. This is my 12th year of broadcasting. I confused the name of Gene Hackman at 20th Century Fox with Gary Hagman, the son of Mary Martin. That's broadcast number 566, October the 11th. I was talking about the dangers of 20th Century Fox and giving the quotation last week from Forbes magazine. It was a quotation of the chairman of Fox Studio, Dennis Stanfield, before the studio was sold to Marvin Davis. It was right at the period of the transactions. He said if 20th Century Fox's recent management of Evil were filmed, it would be too bloody for your kids to see. I was referring to Grace Kelly being on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox, and also the attorney. It's for Gene Hackman and for Marlon Brando, Norman Gary, and his suspicious death just last August. He worked for various persons under investigation at 20th Century Fox at the present time. Marlon Brando made the movie The Formula. It was a candied down and censored version of the I.G. Farben oil monopoly, but he did star in that part, and it made it last year for MGM. And Steve Sagan, who wrote the book The Circle, said that Vic Morrow, who died in the helicopter crash, I've done some broadcasts on that Morrow advised him on how to finish off his book, The Circle, which was about Korea Gate, the Korean CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the narcotic dealings of the CIA and the Korean CIA, and Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox also, and I mentioned Mr. Landis, the director of 2 movies of John Belushi's, The Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and Belushi's recent demise in Hollywood under circumstances that are now being opened up and investigated again, that the LAPD was satisfied to cover up. So there's been these deaths around the studio, Grace Kelly, Norman Gary, Vic Morrow, and John Belushi, and the comments of the head of 20th Century Fox on how bloody it was to be around there in this particular time period. Now, that doesn't make excuse for the wrong names, but I'm sorry about that. It wasn't Larry Hagman. On broadcast number 562, that was August the 13th, 1982, the title of one of the subjects that week was The Skin Competitors, with a question mark, having to do with the near-fatal car crash of Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin. One person did die in that particular crash. And a month later, Time magazine had a story under Economy and Business, Shakeout in the Skin Game, the recession squeezes some of the big names in cosmetics. So as I referred last week to the Tylenol or the Bayer aspirin war, and I'll go into more of that in a moment, there are corporations fighting each other, and in every case where I study the details of these particular controversies, there are many suspicious deaths that are taking place involving persons having a deciding a profit or a position in that competition market. I do want to do a resume each week of what happened, not a resume, but maybe 1 minute time of what happened a year ago, this past year ago. The weeks go so fast and the months go fast, and a year leaves a lot of unanswered investigations that never do get opened up, but they are worth remembering. And if we do this once a year, it'll be a resume for 1 minute of what passed the last year and what's going on now. Just a year ago, October 18th, 1981, I was talking about the Greek connections to the pressure of the administration to tighten down on identification of CIA agents, the murder of an agent chief in Greece, Mr. Welch, and the indication that he was murdered by the CIA for the purposes later of enacting laws whereby it would be a crime to mention the names of the CIA agents, even if they themselves had committed crimes, and to stop the Freedom of Information Act and to have a ban on disclosing the identity of agents. We went into the Greek connections to Richard Helms, to Frank Turple, Edwin Wilson, and how the CIA murders one of their own agents who's expendable in order to get more laws to protect the current agents. I also mentioned the scandal of the murder of Anwar Sadat and the role that Mr. Mubarak had, and Mr. Mubarak's son-in-law, Brigadier General Sabat, and the Egyptian Prime Minister Abu Ghazala, and their role in sending billions of dollars allegedly through the Camp David Agreement to Anwar Sadat, but they were actually going to arm the PLO and buying weapons. And certainly when the tunnels were exposed in Lebanon recently, and the Israelis went in, there were many, many weapons, and there's no telling whether the Soviet Union sent all of those or whether they were purchased with American tax dollars and were sitting in these tunnels because millions of dollars were diverted to the PLO. 1 year later, Jack Anderson had, just 2 weeks ago on his syndicated radio program, it's on Sunday nights if you haven't caught it yet, on NBC at 6 o'clock, he brought up the dummy fronts in Egypt, the offices with just a doorknob and no one inside, the multi-billion-dollar shipment of weapons, the Swiss corporations, the links of the CIA and the Pentagon to specific people like Thomas Clines and Edwin Wilson and the former CIA assassination teams. And around Sadat were all of his enemies allegedly working with him in the government. And when the shooting happened, Sadat was sitting in the middle. He got 26 bullets. Mubarak was on the right and Ghazal on the left. They didn't get any. He got all 26 and died, and they took over the government and the arms shipment. I did get a telephone call and a letter from Ted Gandolfo. Many of you long researchers know his name, and some of you may be surprised that I even use it on the broadcast because you don't approve maybe of some of his techniques or the way he does things. I'm not putting a value judgment on him. He is a sincere researcher in what he does, and he has literally devoted years to expose the House Select Committee on Assassinations that got many millions of dollars to look into the murder of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King, and G. Robert Blakey of the CIA, who covered this up again for the second time and locked the evidence up, a lot of it for 50 years. Ted made continuous tape recordings of conversations with every member of the House Select Committee. He talked with Jim Garrison and tape recorded the part left out of the second report that you should have. He tape recorded the non-disclosure agreement between the people working for the committee and the CIA and FBI on what would happen to them if later they told all that they knew during these hearings. They couldn't publish a book on how Blakey covered up with the CIA and the FBI. Now, he has a lot of tapes available. He has 26 hours of tapes. They're on 90-minute tape cassettes. He's got 18 cassettes, and he's selling them for $17.95. That's a bargain if you're a collector. It's less than $1 a cassette, $3 for postage. But if you write to him, he will send you a list of what is on these cassettes. And if you are interested in American history, in the truth of the cover-up, I think he's done the best job of anyone in the country on that area. And you've got to give him credit for the intensity and the sincerity of doing that particular job. Each of us has to do our own thing, and his is to try to tell the world how Congress continues to lie, that the cover-up didn't happen, say, with the Nuremberg trials or with Watergate or with Kennedy assassination, the Warren Committee, or Koreagate. It goes on continuously, and he has that well documented. Ted Gandolfo, Gandolfo is his name, 1214 First Avenue, 1214 First Avenue, New York, New York, 10021. You can write and get the list, and if you didn't get it by my saying it, write to me. You have my P.O. box or my home address, and I'm listed in the book, or call me, and I'll give you the information, and you can order the list from him to know what's available. And if you want, get the tapes I know that they're worthwhile. I know the tapes are worthwhile. I also want to tell you that I sent for a book that was advertised in the magazine section of the Sunday newspapers all over the United States. We talked about this at various researchers when the ad came out. It's called Conspiracy in Dallas, The Case of Conspiracy with the CIA. It's by Wayne Fairchild, and he said allow 7 weeks for delivery, and it did come 7 weeks later. That address is Fairco, Fairco, P.O. Box 448, Shreveport, Louisiana, 71161. I will do a 1 hour analysis, as I did with David Lifton's Best Evidence, on this book, the good points, the weak points. He leaves out the Tsarist Russians, and he leaves out the Nazi connections, the GEHLEN connections, the Permindex connections. He has simplistic terms like Lee Harvey Oswald's friend was a Russian immigrant. Russian, Nazi war criminal. Father managed the Nobel oil fields in the Tsarist Russia, the Baku oil fields, and their links with the highest echelon of military intelligence and the GEHLEN network. He doesn't make those connections, but some of it is good, and he's got an index of names. It's a book that you can't lose anything for $4, and you might learn a lot, and you do need an interpreter. I'll be your interpreter and take you through it, but I'm not going to do it this evening. I'll do it sometime when I have time to spend about 2 or 3 weeks really being analytical on the book so you know its high points and weak points. But also at that same address, he has a newspaper to come out called Suppressed Facts Quarterly. This is $12 a year. That's $1 a month, and you can't lose by that either. He seems to have had 45 years of investigative experience. I called Wayne Fairchild. As I say, he's not going to put in everything you want and everything you should know. I guess I'll have to write that book. I depend on other people to catch on, but I'll probably have to do it. But he gives a sample of 70 facts that may or may not be known to many people, such as fact 34, the proof that Gerald Ford was a member of the Bilderberg secret society at the same time he was on the Warren Commission. Now, those of you that take the broadcast may or may not have heard me say this in the summer of 1964. He'd go to the Warren Commission in the morning and the Bilderbergers in the afternoon. But there are a lot of people that don't know that. And if you're studying secret societies, the Federal Reserve System, the Nazis in America, the blackmail of politicians like Lyndon Johnson and their sex habits, the use of mafia in the OSS and the CIA, the rigged voting machines. That's a very important thing because the voting machines, I believe, because of cases that came up in Venezuela, are rigged, and the elections are over for this country. If they're just moved a little notch over, then they can vote in their own Gestapo, as Hitler did in 1933. He has a section here on proof that the voting machines are rigged. And a lot of interesting material about the bombing of the war and dirty tricks in Washington. He has a sample of 70 facts, and I would say if you have $12, you'd get your money's worth out of that. If you enjoyed this program, you'll like his newsletter, and for $4 you can get his book. Now, last week I talked about the Tylenol case, the war, the corporate war, the danger of chemicals, the way John Kennedy scolded Allen Dulles, and then John McCone, the CIA, chemical, biological warfare, ruining crops and poisoning it. And I believe that the conflict of the Tylenol right now is Bayer aspirin IG Farben, knocking out Tylenol that has 37% of the aspirin market. So to update for a few minutes the Tylenol Part 2, there were several articles that were of interest. One came from John Judge in Philadelphia, a world watcher there, long researcher. It's from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Thursday, October the 7th, this 1982. G. Gordon Liddy was on television. Did he play poisoning role? Now, they turn around what really happened, but you can learn to translate even these articles at this point. A television program that was aired in Chicago 2 weeks ago was the rerun of a television show G. Gordon Liddy did when he was talking about his book Will in June 1980. G. Gordon Liddy was on television, and they were asking him ways to kill that the CIA does, and do they kill innocent people? And he said, oh, yes. And Dick Cavett said, can you give me several examples? And he said, one of the schemes that the CIA had is called aspirin roulette. You put one poison aspirin in with the other 49, and let's say there's 50 in a bottle. One of them is poison. The CIA had perfected that. Now, when this Tylenol scene was breaking, they did a rerun 2 weeks before the Tylenol poisoning on the Dick Cavett show. They replayed the G. Gordon Liddy interview and are trying to blame the Liddy current interview for putting the idea into this man's head, if it was Mr. Lewis or a group of people. But I assure you that the laboratory studies and so forth, the technology for the cyanide and what happened, didn't happen that quickly. They did the rerun so that they could, when they were testing this random poisoning, they could say the television inspired the man, but the man had a long history of some other contacts. One story from the Los Angeles Times last week, October 15th. Tylenol inquiry seeks to question man. Now, all of you have read in every paper how he was charged originally, and the charges were eventually dismissed, of dismembering a friend of his. The body's arms and legs were cut off in their Kansas City neighborhood. A man named Raymond West, an elderly gentleman in 1978, was a friend of Lewis's and his wife, and this man was dismembered. The excuse for dropping the case in Kansas City was that they couldn't determine the cause of death, but when an extortion letter was written regarding the Tylenol to Johnson & Johnson a few weeks ago, the fingerprints were identical to the evidence they had in Kansas. So if they were identical in 1982, they were identical going back, his handwriting and what he did, to the evidence sitting in Kansas. Now remember, in Kansas City, the head of the FBI through this time period was James Hosty, who was moved from Dallas, Texas, the friend of Lee and Marina Oswald. They visited Ruth Paine, whose husband worked for Walter Dornberger out of the IG Farben network, the Nazi spy network. He was the head of Bell Aerospace there. So that Ruth Paine had international connections, and Dornberger did too, as with Lee Harvey Oswald staying in the home with Michael and Ruth Paine. It was in their home where Marina was and where they coughed up all the planted evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald to make him the patsy. After James Hosty was visiting, Marina Oswald knew Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald had his name and phone number and license. They were very familiar with each other. He was moved to Kansas City, so this is where Hosty was. He retired recently, but in this time period, 1978, James Hosty was still in Kansas City and in charge of the FBI. Now, Mr. Lewis in Kansas City, at one time, he kept diaries. When he was a suspect in the murder of Mr. West, he kept diaries. Always the diary. James Earl Ray, Lee Harvey Oswald, Artie Bremer, the master criminal. He has books on poisoning, which is a perfect way to pull him back later. Now, and his wife, Nancy, worked for a travel agency, and this is very important, a defunct travel agency that has other international connections, and the import-export business is important, and the bank account was used in the extortion note, and they had fictitious Social Security names and so forth. The most interesting story this past week on that case was from the San Francisco Chronicle on fugitive James Lewis, because they tried to give him this same bio, originally the loner, the diary, the perfect crime, the mentally sick, and they say he was in a Kansas City mental hospital as a catatonic schizophrenic in the mid-60s. A catatonic is unresponsive. They're in a stupor, and they're not really aggressive or extroverted people. Schizophrenics of a catatonic nature are hardly the kind to have real estate offices, to have tax services, to have international corporations. But this Mr. Lewis had a home in Kansas, and he had three businesses: Lewis and Lewis Real Estate, Lewis and Lewis Tax Service, pretty sophisticated. He's wanted for federal and state warrants in a land fraud case, so he had to buy and sell and have licenses. Then he had the ALJEEZ International Corporation. I don't know whether it's IG Farben or ALJEEZ, ALJEEZ, International Corporation. Import-export company specializing in jewelry, wall hangings, rugs from India, as well as pharmaceutical equipment. He also had a partner, and they're looking for the partnership with Lewis in the firm that imported pharmaceutical equipment. Now, you go for that, and you have the bottom line of who wanted Johnson & Johnson to stop making Tylenol. The article goes on to say that Mr. West, the elderly friend who was dismembered, was a friend of their daughter's, who was 5 years old. The Lewises had a 5-year-old daughter who died when she was 5. She had a syndrome, we used to call them mongoloids. They have another term for that now. She was mentally retarded, 5-year-old child, and this elderly man used to come to see her, the Down syndrome. And Tony Ann died. Just the news this week, they were trying to say the motive against Tylenol may have been that the 5-year-old died from it. But I doubt if you go out to kill people at random, like G. Gordon Liddy said, the CIA has the cyanide aspirin roulette. Why would a man, if his daughter died from aspirin, dismember and cut up the friend of theirs and take off the arms and legs? What was that for? If he killed one person, he may have even killed his daughter and blamed the aspirin, or under the mental condition of the psychiatrist, be told the aspirin caused your daughter's death. That actually happened with Adolf Hitler after he was gassed in the war and was treated in a hospital, and they decided he had the charisma and was the right person to lead this great Reich that they were building up to fight Russia. They told him that a Jewish doctor had caused one of his parents to die, and he blamed the Jewish doctor for the responsibility of his parents' death. Therefore, he could start making ovens and put everybody in them and so forth. So that they're looking for a cover story, and this is a pretty weak one. The Wall Street Journal has a story, October 13th, Tylenol orders fall 25%. Well, they're supposed to. Another quick story in the LA Times this week about a man in Beverly Hills who was put in the trunk of a car. He's 81 years old. He was kidnapped. He went to mail a birthday card to a neighbor, and he was put in the trunk of the car, and the car was taken away, and 7 hours later they found him. And then the LA Times, a story by Pat Morrison, said no arrests have been made in connection with the abduction. Now, what will happen if you save this article and put it in your file under kidnapping, Beverly Hills, like I do under various titles, kidnapping, I'll put in that section. 5 or 6 years from now, you'll see somebody committing a horrendous crime, and they'll say, oh, yes, he abducted a man in Beverly Hills 8 years ago, but he was never charged with the crime. That Mr. Cato that went head-on into Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin had similarly been charged, and the charges were dropped, of trying to kill a woman by running a car into her, a hit and run where she jumped on top of the front of the car to get away from it, and the charges were dropped. And then a few years later, he repeats the crime. 8 years before, the people in Santa Cruz, a husband and his wife, were decapitated and their heads cut off and their hands cut off this last winter. I had mentioned a man, a Mr. Johnson in Minneapolis, as working with the FBI on suspicious kidnappings at the time of the SLA. And after these people were killed in Santa Cruz, this fellow Royal Hayes, took the gun directly to Minneapolis and put it in the hands of the man that I wrote about 7 years ago. So if you have any interest in saving these things and time goes quickly, you'll find that the guy who took this man and tested his expertise at kidnapping just in Beverly Hills last week will appear again 4, 5, or 7 years from now. I have been making fun of the Reagans and the drug program, of course, almost every week now. It's just hilarious. And before he was ever president, I was talking about the drug king, whether it be Jimmy Carter from Atlanta, Georgia, and the Atlanta Mafia, or would be the Hollywood Mafia with Ronald Reagan, the Vegas Hollywood Mafia. And I gave suggestions on what he could really do if he wanted to stop the drug problems. That was 2 weeks ago, October the 11th. Now, this past week, CBS News had a story which just proves how insincere and phony Ronald Reagan is. The news story by Bob Simon, CBS News, October 15th, out of Miami, had to do with that big net that came down on the drug dealers down there, bankers, lawyers, doctors, a company called Dean International, the laundering service, that the Drug Enforcement Agency had been investigating, and they took drug money and put it in legitimate businesses. But Mr. Simon on CBS says this was a classic sting except for one thing, and this was tape recorded and Betamax by a friend of mine, The but was that the queen bee spilled the honey too soon. And who's the queen bee? William French Smith. I haven't heard that term or used it on the air since I referred to not general, he's in the military for sure, the Senate Foreign Relations, Senator Tower, John Tower, with Grace Kelly's cousin, Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, and in some literature they referred to as the Queen and the little bee and the queen bee, okay, and their kinky sex in Texas and elsewhere, and I did broadcasts on that. This referred to the queen bee and the honey, and the queen bee spilled it too soon. Why did William French Smith do that? Well, you would have to guess, because according to the radio, at least 15 people who would be arrested got off. Now, they could have been tipped off a month ago or a week ago or a day before, and then using the excuse that he gives his press conference, 15 get away. I doubt if 15 could get away in 1 hour unless they were told to get away. And don't forget how iffy and questionable those Bahama banks are, with Mr. Marcinkus of the Vatican quickly stepping down from the board of one of them, and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon's close contacts down there, and the Vatican missing $1.4 billion in Panama, the 10 dummy fronts. And nobody will say where it went, and it could be laundered up with all this dope money. We've done many broadcasts on that. The acting head of the DEA, this is still broadcast, CBS, you might have heard it. The acting head of the DEA, Francis Mullins, said it had all gone according to plan. He was satisfied that with the ones they got, even if 15 got away. Well, why is he the acting head of the DEA? Mr. Mullen was the fellow in the drug agency and the FBI who didn't tell Congress and the senators of the mob connections of the appointee Labor Secretary Raymond Donovan, of the Genovese family, the Bonanno family, the crime families, and the links of them to his construction firms and to his association with them socially. And so some congressmen are holding up the appointment of Mr. Mullen. We had an acting head of the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover was offed in May of 1972, and L. Patrick Gray moved up to be acting director until his appointment went through. But a month later, the Watergate story broke wide open, and he was the man destroying evidence, being told to deep six stuff in the river, to burn his papers, and our acting director never became the director. He went out with Richard Nixon and the other criminals like John Mitchell and Robert Haldeman and Ehrlichman and John Dean and the whole gang. But this is another acting director of the DEA, and they're hoping, I suppose, that she'll forget about the Donovan problems so that he can be the full director. Then Dan Rather continues on the television and says Attorney General Smith and other Reagan officials are going to take a tour to the drug centers of the world, over the Golden Triangle and into the Pakistan's Khyber Pass. I mentioned several weeks ago Pakistan sending $90 million worth of drugs recently into New York City alone. I doubt if he'll get a view of who made the profits and who did that operation, or maybe he is reaching them so that they won't get arrested. Smith may be tipping off the biggest drug dealers around the world. There was a story about the net and the drop in the LA Times also, October 16th, because the Eastern papers aren't carrying this as much yet as the California one. And I can see why California is. They're probably scared because the politics in California, where we give you Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and there's Palm Springs with Spiro Agnew and the Annenbergs and the whole nest of interrelated drug politics, Frank Sinatra and La Costa with Mo Dowlitz and Louis Nizer. There's an enclave of people and Jerry Ford who all worked to cover up the murder of John Kennedy and were part of the active part of the cover-up, if not the actual planning of the killing. And they're all involved in the drug scene, and they all live very closely around the Los Angeles area. So the papers are covering a lot about the drug net. This article on the Operation Swordfish says that the laundered money was uncovered in big operations, and here's the cities, exactly the ones we put on the map all the time: South Florida to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Denver, who are the headquarters in Denver, Phoenix, Arizona, Albuquerque, Chicago, Houston, and New York. And the countries involved are Panama, Colombia, the Cayman Islands, the Dominican Republics, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, and Japan. On side 2 of this tape, I'm going to make a few more comments about Ronald Reagan and his drug connections, and then we'll go on to some other subjects. This is side 2 of broadcast number 567, October the 18th, 1982, KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. Ronald Reagan is planning an attack on drugs. He wants a $200 million nationwide program. And another story in the Los Angeles Times, October 15th, 1982. He's going after more than organized crime. Now, this is the same honeybee, William French Smith, that let those 15 or more off. Okay, he's going after more than organized crime because organized crime is at his right hand with the people around him every single day. But this is what he pulls out from his old experiences, and he's going to use Drug Enforcement, Acting Drug Enforcement Administrator Chief Francis Mullen. He says that they're going after 4 principal motorcycle gangs, the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Pagans, and the Bandidos. And they're going after the prison gangs. William French Smith talked about La Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Now, it's awfully hard to deal drugs in prison unless the guards bring them in, and the guards do bring them in, and they release people on narcotics, doped up when they release them, so they'll continue it and continue the habit. And the prisons, in the 8 years that Ronald Reagan was here in California, I studied extensively. I was in most of the prisons in Soledad, Folsom, Vacaville, knew many of the prisoners personally, knew their families, knew the situations that he created there, turning these groups against each other. I'm not saying that these 8 groups, 4 in prison and 4 bicycle gangs, are saints, and I'm sure they deliver and distribute drugs. But when the Hells Angels, they use that example, broke up the Altamont Festival when the Rolling Stones were playing, at the moment they were singing a song on John Kennedy, they stabbed and killed a man. They were provided with drugs by the CIA. It was filmed by the CIA. It was to follow the concert in New York at Woodstock to show the violent hippies, the anti-war people. They used the Hells Angels, the CIA, this is documented, used them on motorcycles to go into the peace people, trying to stop ships and napalm from going to the bases over in Oakland, and to plow into them, to kill them, to drug them. They provided the acid to distribute. They had the acid for Timothy Leary and the CIA. He was from West Point. He distributed acid to people. The government has drugged the masses, just as the British drugged the Chinese. But if he wants to get his mafia friends and his appointments, his labor appointment and a secretary or other people off the hook, he won't go after the mafia. He's going after the lowest rungs of the social ladder that are used and are exploitable. This is an important story because it's so typically Ronald Reagan. Now, last Saturday, I was down at UCLA for the Students of Economic Democracy. There was a session they had, and we had 2 classes they were instruction classes and seminars, I guess that's what you would call them, on how the CIA was formed by Hitler's Gestapo. And many of you who are familiar with these broadcasts know what I've been saying for years, but these were new people that sat at tables, and I put on the blackboard names of important people they should know, like Herbert Hoover and J. Edgar Hoover and Reinhard Gehlen and Helene von Damm, and a list of some Allen Dulles and J. Peter Grace, and some of the most important people that have managed our lives in the past and are shaping our future. And I had the names on the blackboard and some important dates because I didn't want them to just have a blur when I left, to remember these names and look them up because they'd hear them again and again, and they should become familiar with them, Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and so forth. Then I left the session. There were 2 sessions, and it was very good to meet with these young people and to see, the gray matter going around, that wanting to learn, wanting to understand their society, and I felt very good. And then I left there and went a few blocks away from UCLA to the wedding of a very close friend of mine whose son got married. she asked me while I was in Los Angeles, would I come to the wedding? We've been friends since before we were born. Our parents were friends. That's how long we've known each other, and we were particularly close. So I went to this wedding, and my father officiated, and he had to leave right away. He's 92, and he doesn't stay for the dinner and the parties, and we had to get home, have dinner with my mother. So after the services, and they took a few pictures, he left. And just going from one door to the car, it wasn't that far, a woman came up to my father, who he knows very well. Her husband was the former ambassador to Vienna, appointment of Ronald Reagan's, and her name is Mrs. Cummings, Mrs. Theodore Cummings, and she was very happy. She was at the wedding, and she said to my father, he just said, how are you? What are you doing? She mentioned, I'm having some people from the State Department this week, and Helene von Damm is coming to my home. She's coming out here. Well, that was Saturday night. She'll be here Monday and Tuesday at her home. And the contrast of going from UCLA, where I have Helene's name over the blackboard, explaining who she is, and then going to a wedding where this woman is excited to entertain Helene von Damm, and all these people, most of them are Jewish, and all I could do is just let out a gasp, and, like this. And before I could say anything, or before she asked me anything, she said to my father, now don't tell anybody yet, but Helene may be appointed the future ambassador to Vienna at Ronald Reagan's appointment to Vienna. And then I really made a horrible sound, and she said, do you know who she is? And I said, yes, she worked for Adolf Eichmann's superior. She was Reagan's secretary in California while she was at TCI. She worked for Mr. Otto von Bolschwing, a Nazi who controlled the Gestapo, the Odessa, and the World Nazi Organization, and she's in charge of the Jewish desk. And with that, Mrs. Cummings said, just like, do you know that all Europe is going Nazi? And I was very polite, and I said, yes, I do. I felt like saying, well, damn, and what do you think I have been trying to tell people? You don't know who I am, but I've been trying to tell this to people for 11 years on the air, and I've been researching it for 20 years. But anyway, I said, I know. And so she says, tell me about Von Damm. Tell me. I said, I can't tell you now. We're getting into the car. She was at the window of the car. I said, if you want to talk to me, I'll be in Carmel tomorrow night, and otherwise, you can phone me there. Dad doesn't like to hear this stuff. You can call me. You're entertaining Von Damm. Monday, she had a friend, an attorney, who has been her attorney at different times, or her husband's, and he called me and wanted to know, she was upset. Who is Helene von Damm? Well, how do you explain to people who don't know the vocabulary? Do you want me to teach you the Russian language or the Greek language when I don't even know the alphabet? How do you tell people who've blocked out 30 years of their life, who lived in the belly of the beast, who haven't the faintest idea who they're eating with or entertaining and working with? Now, I was suspicious when Ted Cummings died, Theodore Cummings. He was a very wealthy man who'd moved out from Austria, went to Los Angeles. According to the Washington Post, I have one story here. He had the food giant supermarket he farmed in Long Beach. In 1944, he sold it for $52 million. In 1968, he gave $65 million to the Cedars-Sinai Hospital. That's the kind of money you're talking about, maybe 90, 100 million. If you give 50 million away, you still have to have some left for the family, right? And he worked for Ronald Reagan when he was the governor. He helped him being initially when Ronald Reagan was the governor in this state. And he got this appointment. The only Jew in the administration of Ronald Reagan was Mr. Cummings. And he was sending him to the most anti-Semitic place in the world. And she's telling me the world's going Nazi. And I know what Vienna is and what Vienna was. And I was suspicious when Mr. Cummings was sick. He came home, I believe it was the first of the year last year, and just coincidentally, my father was in Cedars-Sinai having an operation, and Mr. Cummings was there. And first they said, don't tell anybody. The press didn't know he was there. And first story was he had a heart attack. Then they said he had cancer. Then he passed away. And there was very little in the media, a lot in Los Angeles, because he's from Los Angeles, and he was very generous in Los Angeles with his wealth, but nothing as an ambassador position. And as a matter of fact, I have an article from the San Francisco Examiner about a month ago on the California people around Ronald Reagan, and it has Mr. Cummings, the ambassador to Vienna. They don't even know he's dead. So there was a lot of hush about his death. And now that he's dead, she's saying that Helene von Damm may become the ambassador to Austria. Well, that's all I needed to hear, and it really made my dander go up. There's another country that has not had an ambassador for a while. It was described in the Wall Street Journal October the 12th, 1982, if you want it. U.S. ambassadorship to Indonesia is post without a person. And this is about the Indonesian president, Suharto, coming to this country, and there's no ambassador, and it's a political backbiting, and they referred to it as the single most tortured ambassadorial saga of the administration. And it has to do with a particular gentleman who also sounds Jewish, Mr. Abramowitz, who Ronald Reagan was going to send to Indonesia, Morton Abramowitz, but the CIA wants their CIA agent, their counterintelligence agent in, and the Congress doesn't know if he would be approved because he has worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, and so they want to get Abramowitz a good appointment, but they can't appoint a Jew to anything high up in the Reagan administration because Helene von Damm is in charge of the appointments. So they have to go what they call conservative enough, which translated means Nazi. So they're struggling with what to do with Mr. Abramowitz, and that's held up as the ambassador to Indonesia. Now, the importance of Helene von Damm, many of you know week after week I talk about her and her role with the CIA, with Reinhard Gehlen's agency, with TCI, the corporation in Sacramento, with the World Network of the Odessa, of the dream of Hitler and Martin Bormann of the network. She's in contact with all the nerve centers of these people and makes appointments that, like J. Peter Grace, who are business partners of the Fricks and the Nazis, part of the extermination gang and the Deutsche Bank, and she has connecting links to the highest echelon of those that were and still are and will be tomorrow. Now, the importance of the Vienna desk, many of you don't know it, is that all the Jews who leave the Soviet Union leave there and go to Vienna. And the reason they've held up Soviet immigration from Russia is that they claim that instead of sending them to Israel, to their homelands, the embassy in Vienna siphons them to the United States or Great Britain or into other congregations around the world where they can begin America, anti-Russian propaganda, how good it is to be free. They all get books. They infiltrate synagogues. And it is very important to know that many people, the GEHLEN operation, was an agent of, he was Hitler's chief of intelligence, Eastern Division. And he has many spies inside the Soviet Union. And they can learn Hebrew just as Otto von Bolschwing did and Adolf Eichmann. They can study Theodore Herzl. They can read and daven. And they can correspond and marry Jewish wives on the outside. Then they can come into the United States, into many synagogues. And I can cite two that I know, Monterey Synagogue here on the peninsula and Wilshire Boulevard Temple, where people assume Jewish names or take on a Jewish identity who have links to the Gestapo. And I told this to my father 20 years ago or 15 years ago about a particular person. And he just this year discovered things that he didn't want to know for 20 years on this particular person. And 3 or 4 years ago, I came in with some pretty hard evidence, and he pushed it aside. It was too horrendous to know. But again, remember that Martin Bormann left with Eliezer Goldman. He left with the Haganah. He was a Jewish refugee. He was so well trained, Martin Bormann, that the Jews on the boat thought of him as a Jewish refugee. And then when he gets to Palestine, it wasn't Israel yet, they go into camps, and he goes to the Grand Mufti, and then he's shipped to Argentina, where with Perón and Eva Perón and Vita Perón and the whole gang, and Martin Bormann and Otto Skorzeny connect, and all the top Nazis of South America. He loses his Jewish name, and he's Martin Bormann. But many people have kept Jewish names, and if you infiltrate synagogues, if you come from the Soviet Union and you are getting your freedom, but you're oppressed because you are a Jew in Russia, you could be a Gentile with a Jewish name. They take over as secretary of the congregations. They take over the bookkeeping and the money. They know the names of the children who go to the Sunday school. They know who went there before. They keep lists. Hitler kept lists. They still have them on databanks in Salt Lake City. Interpol has them. The Mormon databanks have you going back to the year 600 and tracing families. So a woman with connections to the GEHLEN agency or Otto von Bolschwing, he was instrumental for the Deutsche Bank for taking the property and the jewelry and the belongings, the homes from Jews in Romania and in Holland, and putting in Swiss banks that went into the Bormann Brotherhood, went into the Odessa, and then he comes to the United States, and goes out to Sacramento and is on a corporation where Von Damm does the translating and the work for them while she's the secretary of the governor. Then when he becomes the president, she goes to Washington and makes the appointments. So the infiltration of synagogues is a danger. There was an article May 13th, 1981 in the LA Times, Helene Von Damm, Someone Special, and it refers to her second husband, Christian Von Damm, a German international banker. They were divorced in 1976. She was married from 1970 to 1976. Ronald Reagan was the governor here from 1968 to 1974. So in that time period, she was married to Christian Von Damm. And not only was he mentioned as an international banker, but when the question came up of the debt that Bolivia owes the United States, the international debt and the money that Bolivia owes, and Mr. Paul Erdman had it on KGO September the 11th, Bolivia owes $469 million to the United States, but they owe $10 million specifically to the Bank of America. And then, as I had on broadcast a little while ago, Christian Von Damm, I mentioned these on broadcast 564, if you want the tape, in La Paz, Bolivia, where they're working out the pledge and the foreign debt and the money for Bank of America. The representative of Bank of America in La Paz, Bolivia, is Christian Von Damm. It's reasonable that the international banker would be in California with the Bank of America because he was her husband when she worked for TCI and with the World Nazi organizations. And down in Bolivia is a man, Mr. Klaus Barbie, who was going to leave, I call him the Barbie doll, one of the top Nazis of France, of Lyon. He's called the Butcher of Lyon. He can stay down in Bolivia. He was going to leave there because the government changed hands and go to Brazil, but they don't want him anymore. The extradition date is over, and he works closely with the banks, with the cocaine king, and our government and the CIA and Ronald Reagan are trying to make deals with the cocaine king in Bolivia. There's a connection between Christian Von Damm, the debt of Bolivia, the Bank of America, cocaine, and Ronald Reagan. In the San Francisco Chronicle, a UPI story, September 3rd, Cocaine King offers Reagan a deal. He'll turn himself in if the United States pays Bolivia's $4 billion foreign debt. Well, who in the heck wants him? He has a son who was arrested in Switzerland and put in Florida. And there was another story from the Houston Post. The Cocaine King, the Bolivian millionaire, was going to kidnap the judge in Miami, Florida. There also was a plan to kidnap a judge several weeks ago in California on the same kind of hanky-panky, kidnap them and kill them. This man wants his son out, the Cocaine King. So the intermingling of the narcotics, the banks, the debts, and the Nazis go on. And Christian Von Damm, who was the husband while she was here, is still active in a good part that is related to the Reagan administration. She's making the appointments. I have a lot of good stories and articles about her, and many of you have heard them on the program. Her close relationship to Roy Cohn. One story, big promotion for Reagan's secretary. This was August the 3rd. She got a higher promotion from being just certain appointments that she screened. She replaced E. Pendleton James, another Watergator, in making the decision of who would get, like the U.S. Marshal. The appointments, I say, are not dentist appointments for the president, or I don't take them lightly. Who are you going to have lunch with? These are who will have cabinet positions, suggestions for judges, who will watch the cost overruns of labor in our country, like J. Peter Grace, with his links to the extermination in Germany, the slave labor piling bones on bones. She's the associate of the president. These 8 years he was the governor. She's in Washington now. She got promoted and had direct links to not only Otto von Bolschwing, Hitler's top GEHLEN man to replace GEHLEN. When Reinhard GEHLEN set up our CIA, he went back to Germany, and von Bolschwing was in charge of the United States agencies, and his closest contacts were with Warner Lambert, the drug firm, and that's Hoffman LaRoche, and Elmer Bobst, the president of Warner Lambert. And Bobst was the man, the godfather to Richard Nixon's career, the man who made Eisenhower the president, nominated Nixon as the vice president, and then Nixon brought in the Iron Guard, which was the entire von Bolschwing network. Some of this may be new to you, but it's important that you know it. If you don't know it already, you have to know it, and other people, it can bear repetition over and over, because as she moves up to get an appointment as the ambassador to Vienna, we could repeat this over and over. Now, Warner Lambert is a very political chemical firm connected with IG Farben and their international drugs and pharmacies, but it also is the political arm of the Cancer Society. If you want a good article on Elmer, Bobst, and Warner Lambert, get Penthouse, May 1982. It's on the politicization of cancer research. Starting in 1913, the American Cancer Society. In 1944, when the war was just winding down, Elmer Bobst from Hoffman LaRoche and Mary Lasker from the advertising company formed and became the head of the American Cancer Society. So in 1945 to 1981, they were in control of politicians and molding their minds while making the medications and the budgets and the allotments for the, it quotes, the cure, but there's more causes than cures. And one of the first, for cancer, one of the first people that Elmer Bobst put on the American Cancer Society, when they put it in the hands of the warrior spy politicians and took it away from the doctors, was William Donovan of the OSS. So he knew how to give poisons, he knew how to do people in, and they'd been doing it for a while, even before there was a CIA. But they politicized it and had a strong influence in the Sloan Kettering Institute, in Yale, in Harvard Medical School, University of Wisconsin, Stanford, Rockefeller Center. The American Cancer Society has fingers in many, many places. Now, before there was a CIA, there was a Rockefeller Institute. And a World Watcher in New York sent me a clipping from June 20th, 1982. That's a few months ago. 51-year-old mystery. Did a doctor kill 8 people? A doctor down in San Juan, Puerto Rico, was working. His Dr. Rhodes, Cornelius Dusty Rhodes. He was a graduate of Harvard Medical School, and he boasted in letters of killing off Puerto Rican patients, transplanting cancer into others, while he was allegedly doing a study on anemia. This study of anemia directly killed people, and he bragged about it in the letters that it's an ideal place to work on Puerto Ricans on the island, that you don't need health works. There's a tidal wave of people, and you have to do something. This is a quotation. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave of something to totally exterminate the population. This is a Harvard graduate writing a letter. I've done my best to further the process by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into others. Okay? Now, he went on, the investigation disclosed as early as 1932 that he was doing this work and writing about it and bragging about it. Then he went on to a successful medical career. In 1945, he was appointed the head of the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. That's where Martha Mitchell died of her cancer, and remember how fast 3-week cancer that Jack Ruby got. Well, when Elmer Bobst in 1945 takes over the American Cancer Institute with his Hoffman LaRoche background and chemical background and the IG Farben, the gas that they made at Zyklon B that exterminated masses, and you combine the work in 1945, Rhodes' work at Sloan Kettering, where they're writing letters about total extermination of population. And then this article goes on to say most of this information available on the case is in the Rockefeller Foundation archives in New York, as well as the Puerto Rico General Archives in San Juan. So he was writing letters about total extermination, planting cancer. And so, you know, when a man comes home, he's ambassador, was it a short time, a year, 1 year, or 8 months, and then he comes home. He's the only Jewish appointment. He conveniently gets cancer. He's at the Vienna desk, and then the person who replaces him or who would replace him is a woman who's worked with on the same corporation, translating and working with people where Elmer Bobst and Warner Lambert works with Otto von Bolschwing, with John Paul Getty, with Mr. Fenekes and nephew or relative of Aristotle Onassis, Fenekes, and another one, a vice president of ITT and the head of aerospace out here in the West. And the whole Odessa network is in the Otto von Bolschwing story and the TCI in California and what it splintered off into. And I'm not at liberty to do more now, but many of you have the broadcast that I did on. If you want the article, send a self-addressed self-addressed stamped envelope with 2 stamps, and I'll send you a copy of the article that Pete Carey did of Otto von Bolschwing that brought out Helene von Damm for the first time. Many of you remember that story, how I called Pete Carey at the San Jose Mercury because he did a story of Frank Turple being at Stanford Technology, and I said, go for this. This is the biggest story in the country. And within 2 days, he called me back to give me information about Turple working with Otto von Bolschwing and the organization that Helene von Damm worked with while she was working in the governor's office 8 years in California. And finally, there's just 2 things I want to mention briefly. Next week, I'm going to do in detail the story of the Nixon gang strikes back. There's one article from the Village Voice, August the 3rd, on a gentleman, Pete Wilson, who's running for the Senate against Jerry Brown. This goes into his he's a protege of a Marine, a fellow of the counterinsurgency down in Vietnam, of C. Arnold Smith, of the California Creeps, Ken Reitz, Mike Kerb, the Robert Haldeman Dirty Tricks. You can expect Dirty Tricks the last week. I'm going into the California politics because if he becomes a senator, you get him too, as well as us, but it's up to us Californians to vote on the 2nd and get Pete Wilson out of this election. That doesn't mean he'll die. These guys don't fade away. He'll just slime into another area, even if Jerry Brown were to win. But keep them moving. I think we should at least keep them moving. Finally, to conclude this broadcast, I got, again, from John Judge from the United States Army Times 2 weeks ago, September the 27th, 1982, an article that the Department of Defense did hide Nazis that came into this country. There were a lot of them. They were exposed on 60 Minutes as interrupting the investigation of Romanian Iron Guards. Those are the von Bolschwing gang and the Nixon gang that he brought through his offices. The Department of Defense criminal investigation is now looking into bringing Nazi war criminals into this country. Now, what they said in this article was in the Army newspaper that the Justice Department and the Defense Criminal Investigation Service have a large-scale investigation going, but it's not likely to lead to much action because the scope is too large for a thorough investigation. This is what I have tried to say for years. It is so big, and this is what I told the students at UCLA. Hitler's SS married the OSS in 1943, and Allen Dulles was the wife that merged the two. And there was this careful arrangement to use all the banks, the Schroeder Bank, the Reich Bank, the Hambros Bank, the Chase Manhattan Bank, the same banks that funded Hitler, and bring these people to the United States. That program on 60 Minutes just tapped one cover-up of criminals who came in illegally. And the Army paper said that to go into this now would be to review the policy for the entire Cold War period. The decision to bring them in the 50s with Eisenhower and Nixon was a contingency of their being president, and Elmer, Bobst, and Warner Lambert were behind getting the New Jersey Governor Driscoll to get them in. And this serious situation of bringing known criminals and lying about them being criminals and putting them as ministers into Justice Department jobs, into newspapers, into Radio Free Europe. We have never had a chance to have peace because they were brought here, given a lot of money, given books, given homes, given jobs, given synagogues. The ones that played Jewish probably got the best food and chicken soup and will live the longest because they took on the Jewish names. I'm sure that they got certain benefits that they didn't even expect. But the point is that these people are here, and now they've asked the General Accounting Office and Secretary of the Defense Department, Caspar Weinberger, was there a cover-up? Yes, there was a cover-up, but if you turn open that rock, you go right back to who killed John Kennedy because they were involved in the murder of Kennedy. That's how I happened to study these people in the first place, studying who killed John Kennedy, came to all of these illegal Nazi war criminals who were used in the OSS, Office of Strategic Service, and then and Hitler's SS simultaneously, and merged to become the CIA. Well, Reagan used von Damm, 8 years there. Is she going to be ambassador to Vienna? I hope not. I'll do everything I can before her name is mentioned to bring it up in any way I can. If Mrs. Cummings had said and knew me and knew I was on the radio or had called me personally and said don't talk about it or wait, I might have had to be quiet if she had just personally called me and showed an interest and even wanting to know what I had done for 20 years. But she calls somebody, a mutual friend that I haven't seen in 20 years, and he calls me, so I don't really have any obligation except to truth. And you are the truth. You people who listen and take the tapes, you deserve the truth, and that's the way it is. So in the meantime, read your papers, read your books, study. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM, and I'll be back with you on Monday night.